This spring and summer, we have had the craziest weather in Chicago, really across the United States. Loud thunder, heavy downpours. It just feels like we're having daily storms. It's gotten to the point where it feels like enough is enough. How many storms can we really handle? Today we're going to talk about storms. And as you can probably guess, the storms we're going to talk about aren't weather related, but we definitely can feel like enough is enough. Storms, unwanted storms, have a way of coming to every one of us. They rock us. They'll fill us with fear. They threaten destruction. A number of years ago, a book called Adversity Quotient presented research on why certain people succeed when almost everybody else in the same situation failed. They looked at everything from entrepreneurs who made it big when all the others got crushed, to kids from gang-dominated neighborhoods who rose above when almost all their peers got dragged down into it, to mountain climbers who kept on going when others turned back and gave up. The conclusion they came to is that the most important factor in achieving success in life is not how smart you are or what specialized skills you have, or even how strong your relationships are. The most influential thing is how you deal with adversity, how you weather the storms. Because the storms are going to come, and how we weather them will shape our lives. Today we are continuing our series, The Lake Effect. Much of Jesus' ministry before his crucifixion and resurrection took place on the shores of Lake Gennesaret, also known as the Sea of Galilee. In this series, we're looking at several key encounters that Jesus had with his followers to see what we can learn from his life about our own relationships with him. And as in today's story, Jesus' disciples find themselves in the middle of a storm. It says, that day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Mark describes this storm as a furious squall, which means it wasn't just heavy rain and high winds. I don't know if you've ever seen the movie, The Perfect Storm, George Clooney. Well, this storm was more like the perfect storm than any summer thunderstorm. Remember, some of Jesus' first followers were experienced sailors. They'd seen storms before. But this one was more than any of them could handle. Those kind of storms come into our lives, don't they? Storms we're not quite ready to handle. A decade or so ago, I went through what I look back on as a perfect storm. My personal life, my professional life, it all crashed together into the hardest time of my life. Honestly, it was more than I could handle. We all are faced with storms that threaten to tear us apart. Maybe you love somebody and they die. Maybe somebody you love hurts you and the relationship dies. Maybe you get the news from the doctor and you're left reeling. Or maybe you get the call from the school or the police that is every parent's worst nightmare. It could be a financial storm and you wonder how you're ever going to get through it. Or maybe it's a storm that you've had to deal with every day now for years, and there's no relief in sight. Through this story, we hope to learn how God wants to help us, how he wants to help us weather the storms, because the storms are going to come. And I think weathering the storm has so much to do with the questions that are asked in this story. Let's take a closer look at those questions. There's 4 of them. The first question is one that the disciples ask. They say to Jesus, "Don't you care?" It sounds like they're doubting Jesus' concern for them, doesn't it? Well, it sounds that way because, frankly, it was that way. It's not hard to imagine why either. The boat is sinking, and Jesus is sleeping through it in the back. He's sound asleep. When my daughter Bailey was little, we went to the 4th of July fireworks. And she was so excited all day long. That's all she was talking about, fireworks, fireworks. We were at a party. She had no nap. She's just running around nonstop. So we get to the fireworks and we work our way to a great seat, and 10 minutes before the fireworks started, she climbs up into my lap. She falls asleep. So the fireworks start. She never moves. I mean, they were right above us, loud, booming noise. She never woke up until the next morning. And then she was really mad at me for not letting her see the fireworks. Now, I don't know if Jesus was a deep sleeper like that, but his disciples are panicking, and he's snoring away in the stern. So they wake him. No wonder they ask him, "Don't you care?" When storms come into our lives, that's a question we often find ourselves asking. It's one thing to believe here that God really cares, but to believe it here, especially in the middle of a storm, that can be a little more challenging. I think maybe on some level we tend to think that if we're following God, if we've said yes to being a Christ follower, that God should not allow certain storms to come our way. But Jesus has been straight up with us. He says to his followers, "In this world you will have many troubles." Jesus said there'd be storms. And when the storms come, sometimes the longest trip that we ever have to take is from "I know" to "I know." But here's something I love about the disciples' question. It's okay to be honest with God. It really is. I don't picture the disciples casually asking Jesus, "So, don't you care?" I mean, they cried out to him. This concept of crying out to God comes up over and over again in scriptures. In the book of Psalms alone, you find references to crying out to God over 50 times. In the storms, it's not only okay to cry out to God with whatever you're feeling, it's important to. I mean, think about it. Part of having a close relationship with anybody is sharing with them what you're feeling, right? Why should a relationship with God be any different? That's what the first Christ followers did, and that's what we can do. Cry out to him with whatever questions, whatever doubts, whatever misgivings you have. He can handle it. It's what his followers do. It's part of learning to weather the storm. So the disciples cry out to Jesus. Jesus wakes up. He speaks just a few words, and the wind and the waves are gone. Jesus takes care of this particular storm with just a few words. Now, I know we all wish that that's what God's pattern for weathering storms was. Just cry out to God. He'll do a miracle, and it's all good. Man, I wish it was that way every time. But we know it's not. Even for the disciples in this situation, Jesus calming the storm wasn't the end of the process. Jesus doesn't leave it there. After he calms the storm, he asks the second question to them. He says, "Why are you so afraid?" When we hear that question, maybe we assume that Jesus is telling them they shouldn't be afraid, but that's not what's going on. When he asks, "Why are you so afraid?" he's trying to help them see something. Like we said, some of the disciples had spent their whole lives on this lake. They had weathered all kinds of storms before on their own. And the truth is, that's why they were so rattled by this storm. Before Jesus calmed the storm, I'm sure they did everything they could, everything within their power to deal with it. And it just wasn't enough. They were used to handling storms themselves. But this was one they just couldn't handle on their own. We're so much like them, aren't we? When the storms hit, we do what comes naturally. We try to take care of it ourselves, fix it ourselves, weather it on our own. We try to handle everything ourselves because, after all, we're kind of a self-help culture, aren't we? In the storm in my life that I described to you before, I realized very quickly that I couldn't take care of it myself. When it comes to the really big storms of life, self-help it's kind of an oxymoron. It's a contradiction of terms because self can't help. Self may have some suggestions, self may have some ideas, but self can't really help. I needed some other kind of help. Self is unreliable. Self is undependable. Self can't get it done. Self can say, try harder, or self can say, work or drink or shop to dull the pain. Self has all sorts of brilliant ideas. But self can't help. Now, when it really counts, self can't help. And as simple as it may sound, for me, this has been key to facing the storms that have come my way. When the storms come, I need to place my hope and trust and confidence somewhere other than self. Maybe that's what God's been saying to you through your anxiety, turmoil. Amidst the storm is what he's been saying to me. The more you look at yourself, the worse the storms are going to rock you. God says, you need to look at me because I'm the one that can get you through this. One of the greatest things God is trying to do in our lives is strip us of our dependency on self. He's trying to teach all of us to trust ultimately only in him. And maybe you're thinking, wow, that sounds great, but how do I learn to trust God more and me less? And I'm glad you asked that because it brings us to question number 3. Next, Jesus asks them, do you still have no faith? And again, this might sound like a kind of a scolding question, but it's really not. He's trying to remind them of why they could trust him in the storm, why they could have faith. Even though this storm comes fairly early in their experience of Jesus, they'd already seen Jesus do so much. They had seen him heal diseases. They'd seen him cast out demons. They had seen him battle the forces of darkness like no one else could. But when the storm came, it was like they forgot all that they'd already experienced. So when Jesus said to them, do you still have no faith? He isn't busting them out so much as he's trying to get them to think of all the reasons they already had to have faith and confidence that he would come through. And this is so key to weathering storms. Another word that's all over the place in the book of Psalms is the word remember. Remember means to intentionally bring to mind and to dwell on what God has already done for us. When the storms rage, we can gain confidence in God by intentionally remembering the other storms that he's brought us through. And if there's one thing I'm good at, it's worrying. I'm really good at it. I'm like practically a professional. Just a couple of weeks ago, I woke up in the middle of the night and my mind went to a very real storm that I'm facing in my work. Decisions that need to be made, financial risks. And I looked to the not so distant future and I found myself afraid. In those moments, it's as if my mind is telling me, I think this is it. You've been through some tough times before, but this is the one that's going to do you in. And I don't think there's any way that I can make it through this. And in the middle of this storm, it's like I forget. I forget that even though God has brought me through all kinds of other stuff in my life, I think he's not going to bring me through this one. And right now, right where you sit, think about the times in your life when you thought you were sunk, when it felt like there was no hope for you, no way out, and yet somehow God made a way. Maybe he got you out of that storm dramatically. More likely, he mainly just got you through it, right? Either way, when you look back on it, you know it was him who got you through the storm. When the winds blow, the waters rise, and it seems like the boat is going to sink with us, we can weather the storm by hearing God ask us this question: do you still have no faith? He's calling you and me to remember how he's gotten us through so much before. And I know there may be times in your life where you feel like maybe God isn't there for you. It's okay to feel that way. But remember, all that God has brought you through from the past, he brings to the future. He didn't bring you this far just to leave you. Whatever you're going through today, I'm here to tell you, God's not going to abandon you in the middle of the storm. He's been there for you before, and he will be there for you again. The last question for weathering the storms is a question that the disciples asked. They say, who is this? And notice it says that when they saw him calm the storms and the waves, they were terrified, which I think is an interesting word. It doesn't really leave you with a warm fuzzy, does it? But it doesn't mean terrified like they were so afraid that he was going to hurt them or anything like bad. Terrified is a powerful word for a whole new level of awe and wonder. wide-eyed worship. Through this storm, they realized that they were in the presence of so much more than just a great leader or a healer. Their own scriptures said, "O Lord God Almighty, who is like you? You rule over the surging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them." They knew that the power like this belonged only to God. In this storm, they had to reassess who it was that they were really following. It's as if they didn't fully appreciate who he really was. And my hunch is that until we go through certain storms, a lot of us have an overly domesticated view of Jesus. We unintentionally buy into a toned down, meek and mild Jesus, and we forget who we are really dealing with, who it is that is living and active in our lives. We forget that the Jesus we speak of could stand up in the back of a boat and just speak a hurricane or a typhoon or a tornado into submission. Now I realize that when we hear this story and we see Jesus calm the storm so impressively, so instantaneously, we wish he would do that in our lives too. We might say, if he worked that way in my life, if he calmed my storm like that, I'd appreciate who he really is too. Well, the truth is, whether our storm is calmed miraculously or not, because he is God, we can already trust Jesus for what's most important. In fact, the disciples could have trusted him because he had already said what would happen in their lives. Remember how the story started? Jesus said, "Get into the boat. We'll cross over to the other side of the lake." Jesus had already told them they were going to the other side. He didn't say, "Let's go on the boat so we can go out in the middle and drown." When the storms came, they forgot what he had said. They forgot that he'd already told them they would make it through this. When we're weathering the storms of life, that's what we need to remember. It's okay to hope and pray for miracles, but what's more important is to cling to what God has already said. Because miracle or no miracle, in whatever storm you are facing, he has promised that one way or another, he's going to get you through to the other side. I love these words from the book of Isaiah. They are words we can all cling to get us through whatever storms come our way. God says this, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you." When miracles come and God intervenes impressively in our lives, that's a great thing. But the more important thing is to learn to weather the storms by clinging to what Jesus has already said, what he already promised. He will never allow anything to happen that can take us away from him, or that with his help we can't get through. Whatever storm you're facing, he has promised one way or another to get you through it. The one who has the power to command the very forces of nature can and will get you through to the other side. We don't know how long this story took to happen in real time, from the time the storm blew into their lives until the time that Jesus calmed the storm and they knew everything was going to be okay. And we can't know where we are in the storms of our lives either. How long will it be until God shows up? That our confidence in him to get us through it, it is well placed. We don't know. All I know is that there's one who speaks these words to your heart of hearts, no matter what you're going through. When you go through deep waters of great trouble, I will be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. Who is this? He's God, and he is with you in the storm.